Okay. So I'm thrilled. I'm the editor of the book, and I'm thrilled to announce our panelists today. So starting with Nicole Law. There is so much I could talk about with these three individuals, but I'm limiting it to just a couple of lines. So forgive me, panelists. You all have these crazy esteemed careers, but let's start with Nicole. Nicole's an educational consultant. Her expertise is in the areas of school leadership, PLCs, culturally responsive practices, and educating MLLs. Nicole has been involved in so many aspects of K-12 education, including a math teacher, a school principal, and a curriculum coordinator, and she's based out of the Indianapolis, Indiana area.
Hello.
Moving on to Sonja Hollins-Alexander. Sonja is Associate Vice President, Content Advisor, and Scholar for Corwin Press. Prior to coming to Corwin, Sonja worked for 16 years in K-12 education, and she had positions from school social worker to principal to director of professional development in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And this is Sonja's second book. And then, of course, we have John Hattie, Melbourne, Australia-based educational researcher and best-selling author. John's visible learning research is the largest collection of its kind in the world, and he has helped inform best practices in thousands of classrooms and schools, both in the US and abroad. Thank you all for being here, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I get the privilege of starting this today. And it was a few years ago as we were looking at the evidence base, particularly about the role of principals and school leaders in schools, but obviously as well teachers, and given our abiding interest, what about from the student's perspective, looking at the culture and climate of schools. This has been a long research topic, but usually it stops with statements at a school level, and then it's left sometimes to chance. And we weren't very happy with that. But when we looked at the research, it covered so many different parts of what happens in a school. So we decided that we would harness the power of the experts around the world in this area. And we conducted what's called a Delphi study. And you can see the Oracle of Delphi there, sitting there, and she's supposed to be overseeing of all wisdom. And so what we did is we worked together with a team of about 10 of us within the Corwin team, looking at the different ways of thinking about culture and climate. And I can tell you that was a very healthy and robust set of discussions. And we ended up with wonderful disagreements amongst ourselves, with 25 different ways of looking at culture and climate. And then we identified these 11 experts to review them and comment on them. And they did. And in light of that first round, we met again as a team, and we looked at those comments on our first ways of thinking about culture and climate. And then we went out to 86 people around the world. And in our article we've just published, we thank and acknowledge those people who are very, very busy people, as you can imagine, who responded. And they not only responded by rating the ways of thinking about culture and climate, they also made comments, and they were extensive. Sometimes it was words they disagreed with. Sometimes it was the big ideas. Sometimes it was saying we'd missed this. We'd overemphasized that. And so we spent some time amongst Sonja and Nicole and Dominic and I going through those 25 mind frames, rewriting them, revising them, considering them. And then we went out on a third round. And this time we identified 92 experts who rated the 19 mind frames. And in doing this, we did lots of analyses through this. We did our reliability analysis, we did our factor analyses, we did all that stuff. And one of the things we identified was 3 big themes that came through those mind frames. And as you're going to see, these 3 big ideas are pretty much the core notion of the culture and climate. But the point of starting with this is to acknowledge that we did use quite a lot of people through not just in the US, but throughout the world that looked at them. Because one of the interesting things, obviously, about culture is it can be country, it can be local, it can be very specific. But as we found quite remarkable consistencies across US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where these experts came from. And so in light of that, we finally ended up with 10 mind frames that captured the thinking of those 90 plus different experts that got to what we thought was the core notion. And that's what we want to reveal today. And that's what we want to talk about as core notions of the book. And our fundamental argument is it's not what you do that matters. It's what you think about what you do. It's how we think about it. It's how we think about these three big ideas: the sense of belonging, the sense of identity, and the sense of equity. And as part of that, we also want you to think about how students think of what it means to belong, what their sense of identity is, and what they see equity is. And as Sonja and Nicole will relate, we had probably one of our two biggest discussions was about the word equity. We know in parts of the world, like your country, it's a very, very contested world. Now, we don't want to shy away from using it, but in some places where they have made it a weapon rather than as a wonderful construct, we ask you to think of how students think of equity. They think of it as fairness. I think equity is a bit more than that, and I'm sure Sonja and Nicole have informed me of this. Equity is fairness plus justice, but as a starting point. And so these are the three big ideas that underlie the 10 ways of thinking about what we do. This notion of, does the student feel that they are invited to learn in this classroom and in the school? Do they feel that they are thriving and actually learning? Do they feel that they belong and don't feel excluded? Not just from the relations with the teacher and with the school leaders, but amongst their fellow students and with their fellow students. And is their sense of identity, are they able to express this? Now, you don't have to agree with it. It's not the point, but you have to acknowledge it. Now, if you disagree with it, that can become very transparent too, and we'll talk about that. But this notion of allowing students to express their sense of self, because that's what they take when they come across the school gate. They don't leave it outside. They don't leave it at home. And that final notion of equity, fairness from a student's point of view. Are the students open? Is the staff open? Is the leadership open? And have the capacity to appreciate differences? Are there active disruptions of systematic inequities and biases? And the notion that we're going to talk about today is this notion of fortifying our sense of who we are. And these are the big notions. Now, we point these out not only in the classroom, but in the staff room. So Sonja, let's get down to the detail.
So John, if you could share with them just a little bit more about how those three themes then transition into 10 actual mind frames.
Sure. So the first one, as you can see, is we strive to invite all to learn. And as we're going to talk about each of these as we go through this hour, we're going to see that it's then checking to see whether the students do feel that they're invited to learn. They come to this class. They come to the school because they want to learn. They don't come to learn that which they already know. It's what they don't know. And therefore, it's challenging. It can risk failure. And is that okay to do amongst their fellow peers? And is that okay to do with their teachers? Do they feel valued? And in terms of when they are engaged in that work? And have we taught them the skills to collaborate? Not just that's deliberate. It's not do they have the skills to collaborate, but are we actually deliberately teaching them the skills to work with others, respect for self and respect for others? And these are the three big ideas and ways of thinking in terms of belonging. In terms of identities, are we creating the opportunities? Many times, the problem in our system is that students don't get the same opportunities as others. They have barriers to that opportunity. And this is what we want to identify. We want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to have a rich, cognitive, complex set of ideas and tasks that need to grapple with. Not some kids get the easy stuff and some kids get the hard stuff, but all the students have the opportunity to engage in that richness. And then the words I really like under number 5, are we cultivating, fortifying and sustaining environments? And these are very deliberate words. It's a little bit more, are we cultivating environments for identity, but are we cultivating them so they're fortifying and sustaining? And then do we acknowledge affirm and embrace the identities of our students. And this is the one that I wanted to come back to, is it's not just, if you don't agree with it, it doesn't matter. But from the point of view of the students, they want to know that you acknowledge it, you affirm it, and you embrace it. And even when we talk to our colleagues in the staff room, we may disagree with some of the identities, but it's very transparent when that becomes the barrier. And do we then remove those barriers to student learning, including those barriers relating to identities? And the final set of ways of thinking is about looking at the inequities. They've been around a long time in many schools, and many systems, and many cultures. And yes, we know that some of them are systemic and sometimes not completely in our control in the school. And this is why we're looking at these three in specifically. How do we discover, correct, and disrupt inequities in starting with ourselves about our own beliefs and systems? Do we respect diverse cultures and identities? And I want to come back to number 5, and fortify and sustain those cultures and identities. All of us, and I'm one of them, absolutely. I have biases. Sometimes I have negative biases. My job and your job is to help me recognize and disrupt those negative biases, because whilst they not be so obvious to me, they are very, very obvious to students. And we've seen so many studies when we ask students about what does it mean to be in this classroom? Does your teacher like you? And the students say no. And the teachers are shocked because they don't believe at all that they dislike their students. It doesn't matter. That's what the students believe. And that's what we have to start with, looking at our biases and making sure we're aware of them so that we can make the difference to the learning lives of all our students. So these are the 10 big ideas under these 3 headings that we want to talk about here today.
Thank you, John. And so one of the things that we think will be really important as you get the publication and you dig a little deeper is to understand our organization of the information in the publication, because as you can imagine, it's a lot of great, just rich information to learn about. And so one of the things that we thought was really important was an opportunity to provide at the very start a questionnaire for self-reflection. This work of preparing ourselves to create environments where there is a sense of belonging and identities, we have to be thoughtful about how aware are we of our own biases, as John just shared, and are we aware of those things that are happening in the classroom that we need to disrupt and we need to address. At the start of each chapter is an opportunity for us to pause, have a moment of self-awareness, and develop a clearer sense of our actions. This work is hard work and heart work. Before we jump into the chapter and unpack the mind frame, what are our thoughts around our behaviors in this space? Our mind frames, how are we thinking about this work? The other great aspect of this self-reflection tool is it allows for teams to reflect individually and also provide opportunities where they can reflect as a collective and discuss those spaces of shared accountability. And so a little later in the presentation, I'm going to give you an opportunity to see a few of those questions and actually assess yourself in this moment. And then we come to vignettes, which after spending time of being self-aware, we thought it was important to move into a vignette where as the reader and the learner, you could understand and see some of the impacts of what happens when we are not thinking and we are not in the mind frame that will be developed in that chapter. And so when you read those vignettes, you're going to see, I'm sure, a lot of things that you are familiar with that is happening in schools around you, and particularly probably happening in your school. But what we know as a collective is when we see things happening that aren't elevating a student's sense of belonging or their identities, or we are not implementing equitable practices, how do we come together and address those, thinking about what we think about first and then what we do? And then the next part of the book, we talk about what the mind frame is about, and not just the specific research in this place, but when you think about this mind frame, what are we referring to in the day-to-day interactions and engagements that happen in schools, communities, and classrooms? And then we come to a real juicy part, which are the factors from the VO research that support the mind frame. You know, one of the things that I know in this space of doing this work for years, and I hear it all the time, some people want to discount that the practices and actions that we need to take in order to disrupt inequities are not evidence-based. And so what you're going to find in this section is great evidence-based research information where John and team have done a meta-analysis of numerous VL factors. And they've looked at the metas, looked at the studies, the number of people who have participated in the study. And so what I found when I was writing this book with John, Nicole, and Dominique is just strength and understanding that not only are these actions and these practices important to do, but these actions and these practices impact the ways in which students are able to get informed around learning, and they are able to achieve and accelerate their achievement. So there's a nice section in the book where there are specific factors that are associated with each of the mind frames. But then we didn't want to leave you there, because what Nicole and I and John and Dominique hear when we're out in the field is, you know, Sonja, we understand that there is a need to disrupt inequitable practices, but sometimes we just don't know what to do. So this book is filled with fortifying practices that can create that learning culture supported by that mind frame. And so there is a section in the book, we identify 3 specific practices, and I'll show you some of those examples in a minute, of ways that you can actually engage as the educator or as your team in addressing some of the inequities or ways in which we need to create a sense of belonging or elevate identities for students. We actually give you some of those practices and ways to do that in your school and your classroom. And then finally in the book, we end with key messages. And so I don't know about you, I have always been the person who goes to the end of the book first. I don't know why, but it's just a way that I read the book, particularly magazines. I just like to go to the end. And so when you look at the work and you look at the key messages, it's just another way of identifying what are some of the key things that are discussed in that chapter. This is also an opportunity for you to be able to share those key messages with each other in your learning community and have some real deep reflective conversations about them. So powerful learning in this mind frame book is at your fingertips, and we're excited to be able to share it with you.
Thank you, Sonja. So as we think about these terms, school climate and school culture, what we know that we use those terms interchangeably. However, they are not the same. I love the way Fisher and Fry that they have stated the differences. Culture is what we do. Climate is how it feels. I'm going to say that again because it is so impactful. Culture is what we do, and climate is how it feels. And so as we think about culture and climate and the culture of a school, you can advance, Sonja. The culture of a school refers to the shared beliefs, values, norms, traditions, practices that shape the experiences within a school. Culture has been defined as the personality or the health of a school. This includes the identities, the attitudes, the behaviors across the school and the culture. And it influences the way that community members, be it teachers, leaders, parents, community members, scholars, the way they collaborate and learn within that school. Fullen in his research stated that culture is that mission lived out loud. I absolutely love that. And it is how the school operates. And so as we think about a school culture, we have to make sure that that culture is welcoming. And a welcoming school culture is one that fosters inclusivity, respect, that sense of belonging among all, not just students, every member in that learning community. And there are some key elements that we discussed in this area. We talked about how is it that you increase parent and community engagement. And as I was seeing people log in and share who they were and where they were from and put in questions, I saw Dr. Lance from U46. And I'm going to give a shout out because Dr. Lance and her team, they know how to increase parent and community engagement. They have an African American parents group that meets at night, and you would see the men cooking dinner and having the babies on their shoulder and individuals with their wives, and we would Zoom in and have those community engagement sessions. And that was to create that culture that's welcoming for all, not just for scholars, for all the members in the learning community. Something else that I want us to think about when we're having a welcoming school culture is that we have to consider, how are we enhancing? Sonja talked about those culturally fortifying practices. Therefore, instructional, curricular, organizational, and programmatic practices in order to meet the needs of all learners. We also want a culture that has the conditions for learning that are ever present. And so what you'll notice in the publication, creating a school culture where the conditions for learning are ever present, involves being intentional, involves planning, ongoing effort as a means to measure impact. We're constantly measuring impact. We're taking a holistic approach, and we consider the emotional, the social, and the intellectual needs of our scholars. So that will include that whole notion of acceleration. John, I love that you talk about acceleration. One of the things that Sonja and I talk about when we look at instructional culturally fortifying practices is that remediation is exclusive. However, acceleration is inclusive, is for all. And so as we think about those conditions for learning, that then takes us into the next one. A culture has to be how we examine our behavior, how our behavior affects ourselves, others, and the world around us. So what does this involve? This involves fostering a community of empathy. We don't even talk about that in schools. Empathy, responsibility, and connectedness. And so what we're focusing on here is a culture of empathy and EQ, that emotional intelligence. A culture has to be one with shared beliefs, that we all feel like we're a part of something great. I just don't go to this place where I learn for 7 hours, or I'm teaching third graders for 8 hours or 7 hours. It is where I feel like I'm a part of something. And so this type of school culture is characterized by enthusiasm, commitment, and a deep-seated belief in the value and the uniqueness of a group's endeavors. It is where we elevate the collective efficacy of the members in the learning community. It is where we not only, because my mama told me, you all, that you can't pour from an empty cup. And so if I don't have efficacy, how can I be a part of the collective efficacy? So it's where we also identify the individual efficacy, and we're intentional in enhancing the individual efficacy of the members of our learning community. As we think about a culture, this is one of my favorites, a culture in which language creates, facilitates personal pride, purpose, and power. Practices that strengthen this area are not limited to, but they involve affirmative language. What is affirmative language? Growth producing feedback. identity affirming practices, such as we hear a lot about micro invalidations, micro assaults, micro insults. This right here is micro affirmations. I see you, John, and I thank you for your years of research that you have given to the field of education. Sonja, it has been a pleasure to work with you, bringing forth your yin to my yang to make publications come forth. Micro affirmations, being able to have that language that is affirming. The next one is a culture must be nurtured. And so as we think about a culture that is nurtured, nurturing culture is an investment. What is it an investment in? The group's future success and the well-being. It's going to require patience because as cultural shifts, we know they don't happen overnight, but we have to stay firm and be consistent in nurturing those cultures and being able to maintain the practices that we put in place. And if we see that something is not working to the degree that we want it to work, we have to have the courage to abandon it. As we think about this section, I want to leave you with a culture that is built for every student, creates a climate for every student to thrive. As we think about school climate and that effect size, you can advance, Sonja, 0.53. Culture is what we do. Climate is how it feels. So the school climate is where the students experience the love, the culturally fortifying practices, the teacher-student relationships, all of those amazing effects that we know that they lift the cognition and emotional engagement of scholars. As we think about, you can advance, Sonja. As we think about BIE, it was a pleasure to delve into these mind frames. You heard John say in one of our favorite quotes, Sonja and I both, we love this quote, and we have to unpack it because sometimes people look at us with a lack of understanding sometimes. And so it's not what we do, but it's what we think about what we do. Mm-hmm. If we believe that what we do is going to have a significant impact, then let's put those practices in place and have the efficacy and the belief that it's going to make a difference. And so these mind frames, John introduced us to the 3 for belonging. And I just wanted to point out to the team that some of these factors that you're going to see in the book that are aligned to these mind frames are one of my favorites, students feeling disliked. It is negative 0.26. And because John Hattie is in that meta-analysis all the time, it used to be negative 0.29. And so I have to stay on my toes because he is doing constant research and constant updates in that meta-analysis of Meta-X. And so students feeling disliked, not if they are disliked, if they feel disliked. Negative 0.26 you'll read about. You'll also read about teacher-student relationships, 0.62. We always talk about teacher-student relationships, but we give you some very specific ways on how to strengthen those relationships with your scholars.
And so as Nicole just provided us the intro into those first 3 mind frames, and the theme that they are centered around is the theme of belonging. But what I'd like for you to take an opportunity to do, I mentioned to you before when I did a walkthrough of the way the publication is organized, that at the start of every chapter is a self-reflection. And so I want you to look here and see that Mindframe 2 says, we value student engagement and learning. in an affirmative way. We strive to eliminate exclusion by creating a learning community that values student voice and engagement in learning. So even before you delve deeper to learn more about what this means in that chapter, if you are self-aware and you look at these two questions, how might you respond to them? And so Melissa is going to put up a poll for us so that you can actively participate now. Question number 1, we are very good at recognizing that our actions impact students' engagement and telegraphing our expectations for students' learning. So you can see that you have 5 choices there. And again, this is self-reflection. At this point, there is no allocation of anybody's name because that's not what's important. What's important is that we're being very thoughtful about how we think and thinking of the actions that we're going to take to disrupt that if we need to. So do you strongly disagree, somewhat agree, mostly agree, or strongly agree? Go ahead and make a choice. And then the second question is, we are very good at ensuring that instruction is engaging and students can drive their learning. Again, when you think about that practice and you think about the role in which you are serving in, if it's an educational capacity or you're supporting, educators with supporting students, which one of those would you identify for yourself at this time? And so I'm going to give you just a few more seconds, and then Melissa's going to show us just kind of where all of us or all of you who participated in this polling, where we fell in our identification of self-awareness in this questionnaire. Melissa? Okay. So as we see here, which is critically important, we have a few strongly disagrees, a limited number, two disagree. We have quite a few, somewhat agree, mostly agree, or strongly agree. 4, we are very good at ensuring that instruction is engaging and students can drive their learning. Now, I don't have time to unpack this with you in the webinar, but I want you to think about the many ways in your school community, in your learning community, that you can take data like this and really begin to have a conversation around the actions and the practices that you're going to implement so that this is a practice that we always do. All right, the next one, Melissa, how did we fare on the next one? All right, similar. And the same thing. How can we, as you walk away, use this data for yourself when you engage in this book? So there are 8 questions, right, Nicole, for each of the questionnaires at the front of every chapter. So there's an opportunity before you jump into the content to really think about ways in which you yourself are acting and thinking on this mind frame and ways to start considering disruption. Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. So to go to the next slide, as you recall me sharing, at the latter part of the book are those fortifying practices that create a learning culture. So what we just saw is we're looking at Mindframe 2. We did a self-awareness questionnaire to have an understanding as to what degree are we implementing certain practices. We're going to read about those factors that Nicole just mentioned. We're going to learn about what the mind frame is, and then we're going to offer you opportunities to really consider some very impactful practices and ways for you to engage as an educator, as a team, to disrupt and to fortify those practices for the students. So this one right here is really about school voice. And I know that many of you have heard about it's important to elevate student voice, but it's important to elevate student voice to promote inclusion. And so here are just a few examples of strategies that you can actually engage in to elevate that student voice to promote inclusion, and explanations to go with it. If you're at a school as a singleton or as a single teacher, you could look at this book and identify for yourself. And these, next 6 weeks, I'm going to really start looking at, student perspectives on governing bodies. And I want the people on my team to do this work with me. So this is just one example of an opportunity that you can engage in as a teacher or as a learning community to start implementing these fortifying practices so that we can strengthen our skill set in order to make sure that this mind frame is not only something that we're thinking about, but it's something that we actually do.
Thank you, Sonja. That was really fun. Those polls, I love it. Thank you. All right, identities, the second area, the big idea. And so Sonja and I, in our first publication, we talked about the dimensions of identities and really thought about Kimberly Crenshaw's work and intersectionalities and how you're made up of multiple identities. I just don't show up as a Black woman, but I am a Black woman with multiple dimensions of identities. And so in this section, we are going to look at the VL research or influences research that really connects to the identities. We looked at teacher expectations. And if you're a part of our Visible Learning Facebook group, go join it as soon as you can. Sonja and I, along with John Almaro, did a couple videos on teacher expectations. And so you get to a little sneak peek in teacher expectations. That effect size is 0.44. We also talk about, and I'm not going to give you the effect size, but we also talk about teacher expectations based on physical attractiveness. Now that blows my mind. That's like a yikes. And is who the teachers believe are cute, are cheeky, and it's not females, it's white males. John's smiling because we had a hefty conversation about that. Yeah. Teachers' expectations based on how attractive you are. And then self-efficacy. I mentioned self-efficacy, 0.67. 0.67, quite significant. And that is all about identities. And Sonja's going to take us through another assessment.
Yes. So now we are in the book, in the middle of the book around the identities theme. And Mindframe 4 is we ensure equitable opportunities to learn. So just as you did in the previous, self-reflection questionnaire, I want you to think about the questions that are here and respond based upon the scale that we provided. And then we'll have a moment to see the results and just kind of think about what that means, particularly for our learning community here in the webinar. So Melissa, we're ready. So the first question, we are very good at providing opportunities for each student to learn by removing barriers to their learning. And again, you have 5 choices there. And then the second question is, we are very good at identifying injustices, social barriers, and practices that prevent students from learning. And again, you get an opportunity to be self-aware, identify what that means, and as we just mentioned before, go deeper into the book and spend some time thinking about how to address that. So hopefully you've had a moment to select your choice. Melissa, can you show us the results? Melissa is Ivana. Wow. So we have 12 out of 92 disagree, and then we have some somewhat agree, and then we have some mostly agrees. But again, kind of still in the middle area, not polarized on each end, but an opportunity for us to reflect and really think about when we are in our teams and we're having those professional learning community conversations, what are the ways in which we can think about our responses here and what might be some ways that we can disrupt this and do something different. And you could spend time on one of the chapters, one of the mind frames, and actually work through what that process could look like for you and your team. Thank you, Melissa. And so in chapter 4.5, is chapter 4, we have a fortifying practices, which is 4.5, and it reflects examples of equitable scheduling practices within the Master Schedule School Assessment. Oh boy, do I remember when I was a principal and it was time for us to really consider the master schedule. And that was probably one of the things that I did that I'm most proud of, that was a true disruption, because what I found in the school where I was the principal, many of our multilingual learners were being pulled out, of course, for getting services. But what I found is that where the location of where they were being pulled out was in our portables. Some people call them the trailers, and they were losing. We calculated an hour to an hour and 30 minutes of instruction just through traveling for the week. And so I, with the team of educators, the other teachers, we thought about what would be equitable for these students and what could we do differently with our master schedule. So I love this activity because oftentimes the master schedule is built in a bubble, but the master schedule is really like the law for what happens in schools. And so it's an opportunity at the onset for us to set some expectations and for us to develop some equitable practices, because we have an awareness of the data and what the data is telling us that our students need. And so here is just another example. I pulled out a few questions here, but there are multiple questions to this process in the book, where again, educators come together and they consider what pieces of this to implement, what might be a priority to implement, and what are they actively implementing.
All right. Now the third big idea, equity. And this brought some very, very heated and robust conversations. And we love the work that we do around equity. And so as I think about the influences in the VL research that are highlighted in this section, two that I love talking about. One, stereotype threat, negative 0.29. Type hijacks. Type that in the chat. Hijacks. Stereotype threat hijacks learning. I am afraid that I am going to confirm what is believed about me or a group that I belong to. Stereotype threat hijacks learning. I don't want to confirm or conform to what is believed about me. I have an IEP. I've had an IEP since I was in the 3rd grade. I am now a 9th grader and I still have an IEP. I never matriculated out of special services. And so now there's a belief that I have that I'm not smart. And I'm afraid that everyone else believes that I'm not smart. So I sit back and I don't share. Or I'm a multilingual learner, and because of my dialect and because of my accent, I don't share, but I understand the content. But because I don't have the language, I don't share, because I'm afraid that I am going to confirm or conform to what I believe is thought about me or my group. Black children, we can go on and on and on about stereotype. It's not just about race. I hope you heard that in my examples. It could be your cognitive ability, your linguistic ability, any of those dimensions of identities. It is a hijacker, negative 0.29. The other one that you'll read about, teacher estimates of achievement. When I believe you can, and I can estimate how you're going to do and support that learning, it's a heavy hitter, 1.21. It accelerates. It has the potential to accelerate learning. Sonja's going to do another poll.
Awesome. And so now we're at the latter part of the book and that third theme around equity. And so Mindframe 9 is we respect diversity. So we acknowledge, affirm, and seek to embrace, respect the diverse cultures and identities of our students, communities, and colleagues. And so again, we have this self-reflection at the beginning of the chapter. So I want you to look at these questions and consider, how would you respond to this? And so, Melissa, I think we are ready. So question number 1, we are very good at respecting the diverse cultures and identities of our students, communities, and colleagues. And one of the things that Nicole just said is we definitely have to think beyond, not that race isn't critical, and my goodness, it's a real challenge, but we have to think beyond race being the only way that our students show up with varying identities. So how good are we at respecting those diverse cultures and identities of our students and communities and colleagues? And then the second one is we are very good at using methods and practices that fortify the many identities of our students, communities, and colleagues. So John said in the very beginning of our presentation that we want to make sure that students don't feel like they have to check their identity at the door before they walk in the school. So what methods and practices are we doing to fortify the many identities of our students, communities, and our colleagues? What are we intentionally creating in order to fortify and build those cultural spaces where people know that you see me, you value me, you validate me? And so I'm going to give you a second to respond. It's really a real second because I know you already have. Okay, Melissa, I think we're probably ready. Okay, somewhat agree, mostly agree, strongly agree. And so again, the beautiful part of these polls is there is no shame and blame. There is an awareness. And when we are self-aware and we use the disposition of reflexivity, we can act on those things that we need to do. And so a good piece of us engaging in this type of work around equitable practices and belonging and identities is having the right conversations and making the right decisions and acting on what we know. And so we also have an example of a fortifying practice, and this is developing culture humility. And so if any of you are familiar with the first publication that Nicole and I wrote, Collective Equity, we created a matrix around culture humility and ways in which we can develop that disposition within ourselves and within communities. And the good news is over the last 3 years, we've been out and about in the field and really working with people on culture humility really is, I am willing to learn. I'm willing to learn about myself. I'm willing to learn about others. And I'm willing to learn so I can build the culture and create the climate where we all know that we belong. And this is where we want and desire to be. So when you look at those questions for developing culture humility, they really are, what do we need to learn? What do we need to update? What do we need to refine? And what do we need to reconsider? And so if you go back from the very beginning of how we've organized the book, along the way, there are multiple opportunities for you as a collective or individual to think about ways in which you can continue to develop your learning, expand it so that you can create the learning community and culture that you would want to be a part of and that we know our students, our families, our communities deserve. questions and answers. Okay, so Melissa or Olivia, I'm not sure who's doing the questions, but we are ready for any questions that people may have.
All right. Well, and thank you all so much. This has been amazing. As we're going, you can still throw in those questions. We did have a question from Tad. So, does correcting inequity include reparations? In Mindframe 8, we correct inequities.
Who wants to take that one?
I'll start it then. My answer is yes. You can't just say and identify that you answered the question, strongly agree to disagree, and stop there. Now, whether you call it reparations, whether you call it corrections, it's the action. So if reparations means action, yes. And sometimes it means that you have to correct an action that's been going on for a long while. The example you used earlier on of a kid who's not feeling liked in school for a long time, that's something you can't fix up immediately. So in that sense, my answer would be yes. Sonja, Nicole?
Yes, we have a quote that we love to say. And Sonja, I don't know who said it because sometimes I'm like, I said that. So I don't know. But one of the quotes that I absolutely love is that we cannot correct inequities by feeling alone. We have to do actions. And that's not the way it's written, but it is to that nature. So we can feel, we can have, Sonja said earlier, it's heart work. But if we don't get to the actions, and like you said, John, one of the actions is repair. And what is repair? Reparations. And so absolutely so. And I think that we have mental models on what reparations are. And it's so big that we negate the little things on repair.
And I'm fully in support of what both of you said. And those actions are critical. And when we think about that last slide where I was speaking of, are we willing to learn? If you continue to do things the way you've been doing them and you're getting results that are harming people, then you're not instituting equitable practices. So yes, we have to act and do something different and consider what those actions that we did that may have created hurt or harm, how do we then provide spaces where those people, those students feel that they are cared for? And Nicole and I talk about it all the time. We just don't say love anymore in schools. I don't know why. But how do we show that empathy, that care, that concern, and acknowledge that we have caused harm? Great question, Tad.
I notice Dawn has a question. As a white woman, how would I make it feel it's okay for me to organize parenting groups for families of color? I'm a white male. So I'm going to have a go at answering that first, Dawn. And I've worked a lot with the Indigenous community in New Zealand, for example, our Maori. I work with my colleagues in Te Aratirotira in the Maori department, and I take the very strong view that I don't have talking rights, but I have listening rights. And that gives me a lot of power, actually, to have listening rights. It means I can question. But quite frankly, in my society, we white people have taken the dominance of the talking. It's about time we shut up and listened. And so I think there's no problem with organizing groups, but you have to be very careful about your role. Your role as a listener, not as a talker. Sonja, Nicole?
Yes, I love that, John. And one of the pieces that we talk about often, especially when we do work in the field, is courageously listening. So we talk about Glenn Singleton's work, Courageous Conversations. However, I'm not sure that we talk about listening courageously. And so that gets to your sentiments, John, on being able to listen. And when I listen, I have to suspend judgment. I have to suspend the desire to justify and just listen courageously.
And we have to be in spaces where we are comfortable with the discomfort. So when we're listening, we may not always hear what we want to hear. But we know that there are people who have experienced hurt and harm. And if we've created a space for them to be able to share and give us the knowledge so that we can repair the things that are happening that are not fortifying them or their children, we have to listen. And sometimes that listening is going to provide us with a level of discomfort, but we don't have to stay there. So thank you, team. And thank you, Dawn, for that question, because you know what? That was a brave question. And we have to, in this society, and I commend you, Dawn, we have to be brave and ask the questions that are going to address the things that we need to disrupt. And too often in schools, we are being pleasant and nice to each other because we don't want to be uncomfortable, and we don't talk about the things we need to talk about or have the conversations that we need to have. So I commend you and applaud you, Dawn, for asking that question. Thank you.
And I also, Don, because you're probably not the only one, and I wish that we could go live. So, Dr. Lance, if you're still in here, I would love to hear your feedback for Don, because you're doing those groups. And
She had to
so,
jump out, Nicole, I saw her note. She had to jump out.
Okay, perfect. However, I would love to connect you, Don, with Dr. Teresa Lance from U46 in Illinois. And so she has started multiple parent groups. And when I think about what Sonja said, update, unlearn, refine, and reconsider. I'm going to say those again. Update, unlearn, refine, reconsider. We have to be able to reconsider ways and recondition ourselves to go against what we've been conditioned to believe, that I'm a white woman and I can't start these groups. And so you can start it if that's your population, creating the space for parents to come together and have conversations on what is going to elevate their children's engagement and their knowledge in the school system, being able to understand what their needs are. That's that listening, but just even having that space. And so I want us to reconsider how we engage in this work. Get the work started. It's messy work. Get it started. Apologize when you have to. Let others know that, you know what, I got to unlearn some stuff. We all, John said at the beginning that he has biases. All of us in these Brady Bunch squares, we have biases. We have mental models. And guess what? Some of the mental models that I've been given came from people that I love, that I'm still going to have family dinners with. And because it's a simultaneous truth, I have to update some stuff based on my own journey and my own walk. Update, unlearn, refine, and reconsider.
Yes. So, Olivia, I know we're at 7:29 Eastern. So, do you want us to move forward in the presentation? Because I know there are a few other things that we have to do.
Yeah, if we're ready to close it out, we can go ahead and do that.
Yes.
We like this slide. It's a reminder and a connection to, the little people, or maybe big people, that, we have to stay connected with and remember our purpose.
All right. And if you have any questions that didn't get answered today, please feel free to send those to us at info@corwin.com, and we'll forward those to our lovely panelists and get those answered for you. And thank you again, Sonja, Nicole, John. That was amazing. And thank you to everyone who participated today, and have a great rest of your week.